rather than walk you through the entire process of creating the tutorial again, which is basically all this is, I figured I'd walk you through an already completed comp and show you the various parts. So this is what this comp ends up looking like. It's a moving tile inside a static tile world. So just this tile with the fountain and the people is video, and then the rest is all just stills. So it's built from some high dynamic range EXRs that were shot with an HD SLR. And the reason for doing the static tiles this way was to try to collect an HDR environment. This isn't a very challenging HDR environment, but it did have a little bit of HDR stuff, but without requiring a camera that could shoot HDR video. So shooting HDRs as stills is much simpler. And then the moving tile looks like this. It's just a fountain and some people, and this was shot using the video mode of the camera, the same HD SLR, except for that this is not high dynamic range, it's standard dynamic range image. So the goal was to combine these two into a tile world with this moving insert. And there's a few things that are different from the setup that we walked through. In this case, the lens distortion is being removed in the cards themselves. So if you look at the controls of the cards, you'll notice they do have a tab for lens distortion. And it takes 3 inputs instead of the 2 that you'll get from a lens distortion node. The lens distortion node has the ability to produce these parameters under here, card parameters. It will create the correct format of undistortion that you can then copy into the lens distortion tab of the card. And one caveat, or something you should be aware of when using this, is you should have enough geometry here, because it actually physically distorts the card. So this might not even be enough. You have to have enough resolution in the card to take into consideration the distortion of the lens. So keep that in mind if you do use this technique. It's a good idea to have enough geometry to capture that distortion. I brought the frames for the tiles in a sequence here, and then used frame holds to hold them for each card. So the way frame hold works is whatever number you put in here for first frame, it will hold that frame forever. So this is a great way of bringing in a sequence, like if you shot a sequence of frames using your point and shoot or your little digital camera, bring them in as a sequence and then hold the correct frame for each card. You might want to omit some frames even. So I assembled everything into a tile world like this, and then created a special card that is the moving fountain. That is, if you look closely, you can see it's in front of the other cards. And by the simple fact that its Z is not as far back as the rest of the cards, what we get is a natural compositing of that when it renders through the scanline render. It's got a mat of its own that cuts it out. So this is all I really want of that moving card. That gets mapped onto the card itself. You'll see it's got the transparency built right in. And then because it's floating out in front of these other cards in 3D, when the scanline render renders it, it naturally composites in front of the other cards. Now keep in mind that these cards are still only just rotated into place, even though they look a little jumbled. That's only because maybe some of them have been scooted forward in Z, but none of them have been translated around at all. They've only been rotated or scaled back and forth along their Z, because that's the only way that this technique can ever work. The station point has to stay the same for each shot, and then you rotate them into place. Okay, so moving down the comp, we have a little bit of a lookup to change the look a little bit, some vector blur, a little bit of grain, and that's it. That's all there is to it. The only difference between this and the simpler example I just showed was that there's some video attached to this one card. The lens is the same lens because I kept it at the same focal length for all these shots, so I was able to use the exact same lens. I think it might have required a little bit of adjustment. No, I left it the same. Sometimes when you shoot some of these cameras in video mode, they use a subset of the sensor compared to when they're in stills mode. So that could definitely be something that could throw you off a little bit if you did a similar trick using the same camera like this. And of course, if it was shot with a different camera, which is a possibility, if you could get it in the same place, you could definitely do that. Just make sure the station point is identical to when you shot the still tiles, and then you could put another camera in the same place and shoot a little bit of video from there. And you'll still have to figure out the field of view of that camera, but once you figured that out, it should tile in perfectly. It's all about the station point being the same.